China, basically, they are seeing it through the economic technology investment lens now.
Pakistan's relevance has been declining for the last 2.5 decades.
All these policies, coming out of the White House or wherever, had a method to the madness, and suddenly the madness is the method.
America has stopped signing free trade agreements. This is just a bilateral trade agreement.
Americans don't remember anything. The rest of the world doesn't forget anything.
Ever since the end of the sort of Second World War, the American grand strategy used to mean that we will never allow a peer competitor to rise.
Trump's America first. Is this US isolationism? Is America stepping back from its role as guardian of the world? US India. Are they no longer strategic partners, or is this work in progress? I'm Neena Gopal, and you're listening to Global Express, your window into the fast-changing world of diplomacy, strategy, and global power. In this episode, I bring together renowned experts from different parts of the world to unpack the stories behind today's biggest geopolitical shifts. This is where global decisions meet real-world consequences. This week, our focus is US-India relations that has to be seen not just from the perspective of a US trade representative, Jamieson Greer, saying in Washington on Tuesday that while Indian negotiators have been a very difficult nut to crack, the type of offers have been the best we've received. This may or may not signal an easing of the crippling tariffs that the Trump administration has slapped on India for buying Russian oil, although the India-Russia maritime shipbuilding project now must perforce have also set alarm bells ringing. But we're turning the spotlight on the US National Security Strategy 2025, released last week, the new Monroe Doctrine of our times that puts the Western Hemisphere first. It reflects what the world has long seen coming. Europe is in shock, Asia, West Asia, fear they've been abandoned. India does get a mention in the NSS, but only as an economic counter to China. Is this an America in retreat? An America that is stepping back from its role as guardian of the world? It's America first, for sure. Talking to us today are three experts who watch the US-India relationship very closely. With us is Ambassador Mohan Kumar, former ambassador to France, who has a unique experience in international trade and multinational negotiations, and is currently Dean for Strategic and International Initiatives and Professor of Diplomatic Practice at the Jindal School at OP Jindal University. Welcome, Ambassador Mohan Kumar. Also with us is Dr. Aparna Pande, Research Fellow at the Hudson Institute, where she's Director of Hudson Initiative on the future of India and South Asia. Dr. Pande is a byword on India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, foreign policy and security. Welcome, Dr. Pande. Last but not least, Bharath Gopalaswamy, former Deputy Director at Atlantic Council, Senior Research Scholar at Cornell University and Research Scholar at CIPRI. He's an expert in aerospace, defense and national security and the India-US nuclear deal. He's previously worked at the Indian Space Research Organization's high-altitude test facilities. Welcome, Mr. Gopalaswamy. Let's start with you, Ambassador Mohan Kumar. The signals have been there, but this is the first time US President Donald Trump's inward-looking isolationism has been spelt out in the manner that it has. Where does Delhi stand? The strategic partnership between India and the US was set up to counter China, with India a valued member of Quad. And yet, in this national securities document, China is not even mentioned as a country that poses a military threat. Russia isn't spoken about either. Is that all out of the window? Is this a major shift in US policy? Is this US isolationism, a manifestation of Trump's Make America Great Again agenda, which, prioritizes trade, ultra-nationalism, economic sovereignty, Ambassador?
So thank you very much for having me, Neena. It's a pleasure to be on your show. Look, I think a few shifts are evident, so I'll begin by agreeing with you. This document of national security strategy, I have pored over it. I've compared it to the previous one, which is Biden, October 2022, and also the one which is before December 2016, which was Trump 1.0. And whichever way you look at it, nobody can deny that there is a shift. The question is, what is that shift? As you hinted in your opening remarks, I would describe it as American retrenchment in foreign and security policy. So they're going back to the Western Hemisphere, and the focus of going to be the Western Hemisphere. They're talking about a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. They're talking about defense posture being changed, although I have to say we will have to wait for the national defense strategy, which normally follows the national security strategy in the United States. And then we will know exactly the kind of force allocations which are going to be changed. My sense is that India is still being seen in the context of Indo-Pacific. Previously, India was seen both in the context of Indo-Pacific, and there was especially in 17 document, you will notice that they said, we welcome the emergence of India as a global power, and so on. This is Trump 1.0. But that was dropped even during Biden time, we had a clear understanding that the relationship was going to be anchored in the Indo-Pacific. So that brings me to the next point you made, and which is correct. How does US see China? Because
Yes,
after all,
absolutely.
India's importance in the Indo-Pacific, it seems to me, is at least substantially related to US posture vis-a-vis China. I think the big shift has happened in the areas of US relationship with China, US relationship with Russia, and US relationship with Europe. With India, actually, I dare say, I have not seen too much of a change. There will be some implications for us, sure, and we will talk about it. But the main change has been with China, with Russia, and EU. With
And
China,
Europe, yes.
and Europe, yes. China, basically, they are seeing it through the economic technology investment lens now. I did not see anything in the document to suggest that China will be considered a pacing threat. China will be considered the only, what shall I say, revisionist power, and that China will be an ideological challenge to the US. All expressions which have been used in the past documents, all those are missing.
Ah, that's very interesting. You're saying that
Yes.
that is a huge change then.
It is a huge change. Now it is being seen almost exclusively in tech, in investment, in terms of critical minerals and how to deny chips and so on and so forth. So that is the context in which China is being seen. Having said that, there is a section in Taiwan which I found very interesting, where I think the language is a bit up and down. In the previous document, the Biden document, they have said that they oppose, unilateral changes in the Taiwan Strait. Now they don't oppose it. They say we do not support. Now, I don't know if you can quibble. Maybe the diplomat in me is getting the better of
Yes.
me. But more importantly, they do not mention one China policy in this document. That is significant. And I don't think the Chinese would have kept quiet about this. There is also an expression called military overmatch that the Chinese will not like, because it talks of deterring aggression in the first island chain by using military. In an
Yes.
ideal circumstance, they say we will use military overmatch. So what
Yeah.
you see is a very curious situation where the Taiwanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs has welcomed the NSS 2025, but the Chinese have just kept quiet. There is no official reaction. Of course, in the press, they have said this and that.
If I could bring in Dr. Pande, you've dealt with India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, and all of these countries, all of these years. Did you find the NSS document interesting in the sense that, just in the run-up to the NSS and this very high-powered visit to India by two very senior officials, the US has reached out very clearly to Pakistan, and Pakistan has been rattling India's cage, so to speak. How do you see this? Because this is not something which India can take lightly, given the fact that there's going to be a U.S.-India defense deal that has been signed recently. That's going to that talks about a 10-year framework agreement on defense cooperation. So, how do you see it in the context of India, US, and Pakistan, US?
Thank you. Great to be here on this and good to be here with the ambassador. Quick points. One, I don't think we should sort of, overemphasize US-Pakistan relations. We shouldn't underemphasize the relationship, but we shouldn't overemphasize. Every country has a diplomatic relationship with most countries, except a country you're having war with, but maybe there too you have some relationship with. So US has a relationship with Pakistan. It has continued through cycles. Yes, there was a lot of symbolic, sort of aspect this year we saw. But at the end of the day, the core relationship with Pakistan has not changed. Because the fundamentals of Pakistan have not changed. So yes, sort of American companies may go in for drilling for oil or for critical minerals. But then the US is doing that in many parts of the world. Rwanda, Congo, sort of let's name any country which can offer critical minerals. So Pakistan is not, it's not a strategic relationship. Second, the NSS, the only mention of Pakistan is in the India-Pakistan ceasefire context. There is no other mention
That's
of
right.
Pakistan. Now, that is, if we go back, let's go back to maybe the Obama administration or even the Bush administration, because I was looking at that the other day. If we go back 25 years, Pakistan's relevance has been declining for the last 2.5 decades. It is barely ever mentioned in the NSS documents. If we look at them. And so Pakistan not being mentioned sort of, is a trend which continues. South Asia, barely being mentioned or sort of mentioned, tangentially, either in the context of India or Indo-Pacific, is also a trend which continues. The difference with this NSS is that for the last 2.5 decades, India was given a prominence which was strategic.
Yes,
The
exactly.
context of American grand strategy. And that is something we don't see now. That could be something which can change. We must remember we are barely into 1 year of this administration. So, things change. But the US-Pakistan, I won't really be as concerned about because Pakistan's relevance hasn't increased. Second, and this comes to the NSS, the visit by two senior American officials. The US sort of, it is impossible for any American administration, actually impossible for any country around the world, to ignore a country of India's size, potential, and location. However, all politics is local. And so at the end of the day, a country's domestic politics will, to some extent, frame what its foreign policy is going to be. And
That's
so,
right.
as of now, the sort of, the focus of this administration, and they said it right up front, is the Western Hemisphere, which means the Americas and Europe. It is, sort of a recognition to some extent of Chinese sort of, dominance, a desire to push back, but maybe not a desire to sort of, there's that struggle between those who want primacy, American primacy, and those who want to sort of, simply push back and prevent the further rise of China. And so
That's
that
right.
would be in this NSS as well. And the third would be that they are going to ask more from partners and allies in certain areas. And India, sort of, from their point of view, it's the economic, it's the tech, which the ambassador mentioned earlier. That is what they see as being sort of, is the role that India can play. So the two visits, whether by Undersecretary Hooker or by the USTR office, reflected that. Now, sort of, we can go into details about what this does for the overarching US-India strategic partnership, but I'll stop there.
What do you have to say about Jameson Greer's comments on India being a viable alternative market? I mean, there is a bilateral trade agreement in the offing. They've held 5 rounds so far, and as Dr. Pande just said, the U.S. Trade Representative Rick Switzer is in India to lay out the first phase of this agreement. But there is U.S. invective that the US invective on India for buying Russian oil seems to have fallen a little silent. Do you agree with me, or do you think that the US India on trade and tariffs is going to make some forward movement on that?
So I think I agree with a lot of what my colleague said, Dr. Pandey said. I mean, India is a huge country. The geography where it sits is huge. India has had a massive contribution that's made over, like the the whole some of the major IT, in some sense, the information technology revolution in the United States. India has had a major contribution to play, and today, where the tech world is suddenly in the United States, yesterday I was talking to one of my colleagues in the Bay Area about some of those. The supply chain issues, so to speak, in the IT world that's taking place. Suddenly, the talent cannot be found. It's on one level you have an excess capital issue in the tech world. On the other hand, you have a lack of talent issue as well. Suddenly they're scrambling over pieces. So all these, like politics as usual, some of these you're also living in the uncertainty era of politics, where traditionally, and I go back to this, traditionally all these policies coming out of the White House or wherever had a method to the madness, and suddenly the madness is the method. Okay. So
Yes,
when that
that's very well
when
put.
that happens, and then there is no, when a policy or a statement comes out, it goes through number of channels, number of desks before officially it's proclaimed on the website or verbally.
In fact, on that tech issue, Mr. Gopalaswamy, I would like to just come in and say that both these high-level visits, especially Alison Hooker's, isn't restricted to Delhi. I mean, she's not just visiting Delhi; she's coming to Bangalore as well. She's India's startup capital, its defense and space hub, and there are, the actual statement talks about advancing India's strategic partnership and all of that, fostering collaboration in emerging technologies. But I was told that she is actually meeting, may or may not happen, when she goes to ISRO and meeting up with young techies who are offering key technology on managing the traffic in space.
Yeah, I mean, you would be amazed the kind of projects that are being funded today in the United States on space. I mean, there is a company in Silicon Valley that just is planning to has raised almost $30 million without a prototype, without a model, to reflect sunlight out of space and to change days into nights and nights into days to harness solar energy. Okay, this is the extent of and the amount of satellites being launched either by Amazon or any of these guys, Hawkeye 360, the kind of innovation and the kind of push, so-called, like the gold rush, it's a space rush. So suddenly you need to scale up all these things at a massive space, at a massive pace. You need the kind of talent, you need the kind of engineer, and the United States has it, but still cannot do it on its own. While you want everybody also to manage the traffic in space, because space, what is it called? Space situational awareness needs global partners to do it, and including maritime domain awareness need global partners to do it. So there is a separate rush going on, not very far from India, in Abu Dhabi. Where is the talent in Abu Dhabi going to come from? Okay.
It
Abu
comes from
Dhabi does
India.
not have any local talent beyond a point. Okay. Yes, you can groom and nurture that talent, but where these are India, I hate to say this, but in this context, but India, Turkey are the closest engineering countries for them to mass scale that country. And bunch of this is also American fueled growth as well. And don't leave Europe alone. While Europe does not have the funding and scale as the Americans do, but there is that push inside. Today, everybody everybody is on their own to scale up their own technological power and also insulate those supply chains so that they don't face a situation like this. That's
Okay.
what you're facing. And that's why, okay, whatever may happen at the highest levels, you have Alison Hooker coming to Bangalore, building those bridges, saying that, we're still in the game and you're in the game, so that we need to continue collaborating on these things, because tomorrow, if the Indians shut off access to data,
Don't know what's going to happen.
it's catastrophic on some levels. So.
Ambassador, if I could come back to you, this whole business about the pushback from India on the resisting US exports of raw crops, this corn, soya beans, wheat, cotton. Why is India against these crops being brought in? Is it because it affects our domestic market, the animal content in the field? And, what is the status of India's exports to the US? I mean, textiles, garments, shrimp, agri. I mean, now there's an added rap. Trump has threatened to slap tariffs on Indian rice exports. I mean, that happened, that comment was made hours before the US team arrived in India for talks of the trade deal. What do you have to say about this, Ambassador?
So, Indian exports to the United States are hurting. There's no question about it. I think whether it is the Tirupur area where a lot of hosiery and garments go, or it is Surat, where a lot of gems and jewelry is processed, or we are talking about Noida and places in Orissa, for example, for shrimps. So there is no question. I've had conversations with all these people. They are being supported by the government of India. Every month they are being told, let's wait, we hope to have a deal. But if not, the government of India is saying we will do the same support system. We will put in place the same support system that we did during COVID. The government of India has some experience now. During the COVID, we had to support a number of small and medium enterprises which would have just gone bust otherwise. So I think there is some experience. So the government of India is confident that they will provide a lifeline to these small and medium enterprises. But they are only lifelines. I mean, it will hurt nevertheless. And there is no question. And alternative markets will take time to emerge. You can't just switch from, let us say, US to Russia overnight, for example. That's not possible. So that's the first. The second, as far as imports of ag products are concerned, I think there are two issues. One, the farmers in India are a particularly political lot, and I think you and I know this. And when the farm bills were sought to be introduced by this government, with the thumping majority which they had, by the way, it's only now that they do not have a majority. They have to depend very marginally on some parties. The time the farm bills were introduced, the government had a thumping majority. Despite the majority, I put it to you that it was so difficult for the government to pass the farm bills that they had to be withdrawn. So that gives you an idea of how well organized the farmers are in India. And rationale and logic will not necessarily win the argument for you. Because
And the same thing applies to the farm lobby in the US.
Of course, of course. It applies to, by the way, Europe as well in a much worse way. The advantage they have is that, I mean, not advantage, but the difference is India, 40% of the population is directly or indirectly dependent on agriculture. So you really can't play around with that. No government can, no elected government can. The second issue, as far as American exports to India are concerned, is the question of GMOs, genetically modified. And I happened to be on a WTO panel on Monsanto. I was lucky to be there. And that was the toughest panel that I ever participated in. We were trying to rule on whether genetically modified food was okay or not. And scientifically, the truth of the matter is we couldn't come to any conclusion demonstrating that genetically modified is bad for human or animal health. That's the problem. But yet, public opinion is very strong in Europe, and public opinion is strong in India as well. And last, you have things like can you accept milk if the cows have eaten non-vegetarian stuff, for want of a better word? And I don't think you can argue with this. The same.
So, where, Ambassador, does this leave the free trade agreement? And I'd like Dr. Pandey to come in after that. Because it's still work in progress, right? I mean, you're going to come up against, are we going to come up against more hurdles? I mean, how should India tackle this? Because we have backed off on buying Russian oil to a great extent.
So the only point I want to make before you ask Dr. Pandey is just half a minute. It is not a free trade agreement. America has stopped signing free trade agreements. This is just a bilateral trade agreement. And so over to you, Dr. Pandey.
I think I started to call this the Schrodinger's agreement. At the end of the day, when, or liquid oxygen, when that box is open, we will know if the cat is alive or dead. But till the time the box is open, we will not know. So we will all know when the trade deal happens. But till the time that the trade deal is actually signed, none of us will know that it's been signed, right? Because multiple rounds have gone. I mean, the trade deal has been sent to the White House in about 3 or 4 or maybe 5 different versions. So it's not lacking. The trade deal isn't lacking. At the end of the day, it's a political decision, just like with the farm laws or with the subsidies. It's a political decision which has to be taken whether or not to, accept it and then move forward. Coming to the issues, I mean, I agree with the ambassador. There are a lot of issues, whether they're subsidies, whether it has to do with GMO or grass-fed milk, grass-fed poultry, but sort of, every country knows how to make exceptions for another country. So, if India can allow, sort of reduce the tariffs on Harley Davidsons, everybody knows they're not going to be more than a certain number of Harley Davidsons which are purchased. But say that, we will allow Harley Davidsons to be, sort of brought into India, and anybody who wants to buy then can. On agriculture, India, I believe, has made certain, sort of certain carve-outs. So that sort of a certain amount, if there are people who want to buy non-grass fed milk or non-grass fed meat, or genetically modified sort of products, they can, but it will be a carve out, it will be an exemption given under that bilateral trade agreement. But these are all exemptions or exceptions India will add to that.
But Dr. Pandey, there is another aspect to it which I just read about, which says that the Trump's tariffs are now in the US Supreme Court. So you think India is buying time until the Supreme Court rules one way or the other?
Sort of yes and no. I'd say, many countries may be buying time, but I mean, sort of all the, I'd say the cases with the Supreme Court, there are many people who believe this one may actually be struck down, but that may not, sort of waiting for that may not be the right method. On the other hand, maybe India's trade deal, the way it is sort of, is moving forward, its result may also be decided around the time that the Supreme Court decides to vote on, on the tariffs, because as of now, we haven't heard. I mean, sort of the trade deal may be announced tomorrow by the president. It may be announced a few months from now. We don't know. But I don't know if waiting for the Supreme Court's decision on this issue is the way forward. But I also don't think that there is more that India can do. I guess we just have to wait it out for the trade.
So if I can,
Mr. Gopalaswamy, yeah,
sorry,
sure.
Just a minute before you pass it on to Mr. Bharath. Also, assuming the Supreme Court strikes down, let's assume for the sake of argument that it strikes down. This is the International Emergency Powers, Economic Powers Act. But there are other acts, the Special 301, which America used against India in the past. There is also national security exceptions that they have used with regard to aluminum and steel. So there are other weapons available to President Trump. They're not as easy to use as this one. But that is why I agree with Dr. Pandey. I don't think India would be well advised to wait for the Supreme Court judgment. That will be like waiting for Godot. So it's much better to get a trade deal out of the way, get your concessions on tariffs and move on with life.
Mr. Bharat Gopalaswamy, can you tell me whether you think India and US are looking beyond their differences on tariffs? It's colored its strategic ties with the US, and India and US, are they charting a new relationship? I mean, they've had talks on counterterrorism, which I found quite interesting, given the fact that that the US has got these links with Pakistan now, growing close to the military. I agree. Dr. Pandey says it shouldn't color our relationship, but you have a new US ambassador to India coming in, Sergio Gore, who's set to take office in January, and apparently his brief includes Pakistan, and he's already posting key aides to Delhi, replacing long-serving diplomats.
The if I were to sum it up with the way America deals, Americans don't remember anything. The rest of the world doesn't forget anything. So,
Okay.
because I mean, I don't know. You want to take this back to 1974 or 1947. There is a whole rich history between these two countries that's been discussed and debated enough and written. And people in this panel they know what this history between these two countries is. The reality is, look, America is going through its own churn at the moment. Okay. And I believe the Indians are, they've seen Trump chapter 1. This is Trump chapter 2, which is very different and yet similar to it. What you're going to in physics you have this quantity called vector. You know the direction, but you don't know the magnitude. So the magnitude in this is vastly different, than what was in Trump 1.0. So I'm sure the rest of the world has gotten a rehearsal of what Trump administration was in the first in his first term, the second term, and everybody is trying to do business like it is business as usual, and let's just get past it, and we'll have to buy time to and we'll figure things out as we go along. I think that's, if I were to, I'm not in their shoes and I'm speculating, and I think if I were in their shoes, this is how I would be like. There is only enough uncertainties that I can plan for. Okay, there is so many things going on in so many different directions. So you have to, at some stage, yes, you have to. It's like driving a car, for that matter, in India, right? I mean, you have to, you have to look at your front view, front mirror, the rear view mirror, the side, and yet account for all the uncertainties that come from you from all different directions. And I think
That's well put, yeah.
that's effectively, and I think that the diplomats are seasoned enough. Like, even though there may be a lot going on, they know how to keep a poker face and walk through things the way that, just focus on the situation and the task at hand, and we'll get through this.
If I can come back to you, Ambassador, on on the whole NSS and what it means vis-a-vis America's view on China and Russia. I mean, the Vladimir Putin's visit to India didn't see the defense deals going through, but it did have a maritime shipbuilding cooperation agreement, which is very unusual and a real break from the past. Would that have sent off signals to the US that that India still matters to Russia, although it doesn't seem to matter to the US as much as it did in the past, because it barely gets one crumb, right? It just basically says India, Indo-Pacific, and in Quad, India has a role to play, but it really doesn't have the the role that India was shown as being the country that would coddle China, so to speak, in the Indo-Pacific. Do you think that China is getting a sort of a US going soft on China, and in Europe too? I mean, they've ticked off Europe.
So my broad assessment is that actually India has gotten off lightly. People will not believe this when I say this, but in comparison to what the US has done vis-a-vis China, Russia, and EU, I do not see very much of a different treatment vis-a-vis India. I've pored over all the three documents. I haven't Dr. Pandey, gone back to the Obama time, but I did go back to Trump 1 and Biden document. And I can tell you, India has every reason to be quietly smug. However, with China, there is a big shift. I think they're completely removing all the ideological factors involved in the relationship between US and China. The only thing that matters is how is China going to dominate manufacturing, the tech sector, AI, quantum computing, chip manufacturing. Those are the issues that US is after. And for that, the US believes very firmly that they will get other countries to pay when it comes to trade relations, and they will not be the atlas to bear the entire burden of the multilateral trading system, and so on. On Russia, the biggest shift, in my view, is Russia. They are talking in terms of re-establishing strategic stability with Russia. That is the expression used in the NSS 2025. The reason why Washington has not uttered a word about the Putin visit to India is because Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are already negotiating a chapter between US and Russia, which has to do with bringing Russia in from the cold, establishing business and commercial links, and going as far as to include Russia in G8, although Putin has said he doesn't want to
He
be
doesn't
part of
want to.
G8, but that's a different matter. But I think they want to bring Russia back from isolation. So when US is having a conversation on full spectrum normalization between US and Russia, I don't think US can really object to Putin's visit to Delhi. I believe, but I'm only speculating. I think the US is beginning to see India's logic of developing ties with Russia so that Russia does not completely fall into the tight embrace of China.
Of China. That's very interesting.
100%. It's a reverse Kissinger. I think I really believe the US is beginning to understand now that if Russia is not left with any options, there are actually indications, Neena, that Russia is smarting vis-a-vis China. There is talk of territory in Siberia and so on. You go to Central Asia. I was in Uzbekistan recently. You can't be happy if you're a Russian. The Chinese are just taking over everything. I don't think you can be happy at all. It's your backyard and you've let it go to the Chinese. So I sincerely believe that the Russians are a very proud race, whatever you may think of, and they, I think, understand that they need the Indian option or as
That's
well.
that's that's interesting.
And last, with regard to EU, listen, I'm not going to go on and on. Dr. Pandey, I think, and Bharath may know much more. I would not like to be in the shoes of the Europeans today. That's all I will say. I mean, it is terrible because whichever way you look at the previous documents, no mention of NATO in core foreign policy interest. Second, you talk of civilizational erasure. Third, you say that you please stand on your own feet. And you go on to say that NATO should not expand. So there goes point number one for Ukraine. Already the Russians can pocket this and say that if America does not want NATO to expand, you sincerely believe anybody cares whether Europeans are going to support the NATO to expand? Everybody knows that NATO doesn't stand a chance without the US. So it is
Absolutely.
so the real change, I believe, is with regard to Russia and Europe, and I think the Europeans will have every reason to be disheartened about what they are reading as NSS 2025.
Dr. Pandey, if you'd like, would you like to come in? I mean, there's also some, unquotable reports, reporters who've told me that Japan has been asked to dial it down on China, and despite China's repeated muscle flexing in the South China Sea, attacking Japanese ships, so the US, what we said before about China applies to Russia. It applies to, the, sort of shedding the EU burden. Do you think that the US can actually take all this and actually make it happen? Or will we have to will there be some kind of pushback from EU? Because you have Friedrich Merz, the German Chancellor, actually visiting India, in mid-January. And there should be some kind of move, because I mean both the US and India have talked about supply chain diversification, deeper commercial integration. I mean, where are we going to go with these, all these lovely catchphrases?
So, all of these are what you can call operational level discussions. Whether Bharath and I have, Japanese or Chinese is an operational level conversation. Whether we have a friendship is a strategic level conversation. So whether the supply, who I talk to about supply chains, yes, Silicon Valley needs engineers, but Amazon and Google can just set up data centers in India. So Apple can set up factories in India. That doesn't mean that there's a strategic level relationship. Let's go up 100,000 feet or 200,000 feet. The NSS is supposed to reflect the strategic dimension of what is American grand strategy, what is the strategy for the next 4 years under a president. And the challenge as of now is that this NSS sort of at one level continues what started under the, I would say, the Trump 1.0, the Biden, which is that the US would like its partners and allies to do more. You can call it burden sharing, you can call it, carrying your own weight. The challenge is that they sort of, for ever since the end of the sort of Second World War, the American grand strategy used to mean that we will never allow a peer competitor to rise. And we will push back and ensure that that competitor does not. The Biden national security strategy talked about, an Indo-Pacific, talked about competing but combating China. It talked about Russia and China as being, sort of challenges, but in different areas where the US had to push back. That is not visible in this national security strategy or the actions of this administration as yet, which means that a lot that the US is doing is in many ways sort of, allowing Russia and China to continue doing what they have been doing because they don't see a pushback from the US. And if the US is not the underlying anchor, then whether it is its Asian partners, its Middle Eastern partners, or its European partners, their ability to do more will be lacking because the US normally used to be the anchor. May not provide the money or the military, but it used to provide that underlying anchor. And if that isn't there, then there'll be a challenge. Coming to some things that I agree with the ambassador, where I will disagree slightly, is I don't really believe that the US is trying to pull Russia away from China. I believe this administration sees them as independent actors. So it is to sort of, the desire to open up Russia is for economic reasons. If you believe that trade routes and prosperity comes through trade and, sort of critical minerals, oil, energy, then you are looking at it solely from that lens. I don't see it from the Indian lens, which would be that Russia and China need to be kept separate so that the pre 1966, the Sino Soviet relationship does not return. And so, sort of, there, I don't know how much Russia can disentangle from China. That's my take. I believe the relationship is deep and it is strategic. So to some extent, Russia may have a challenge with China. China may have a problem with Russia. But it's like the China-Pakistan. For China, Pakistan creates challenges, but Pakistan is a secondary deterrent against India. So it is worth the sunk investment, the sunk cost, and the security challenges China has to keep the pressure on India. But sort of, so I
That's
see
very
a lot
well
of,
put.
I see sort of, so that's my issue about, I don't
Yeah.
see that grand strategy yet, which will then help Europe. And I agree with the ambassador. Europe and the Asian allies will have a challenge. Taiwan may be happy. I don't believe Japan,
Of
Australia,
course.
Europe South Korea will.
And India with the Malacca
Yeah,
Straits,
none of these will be happy. And yes,
Philippines.
Japan is facing pressure. And again,
Yeah,
from
I
the
know.
American point of view, they don't want, sort of Japan to do things which will complicate the relationship, which is with China right now. So every country is being seen more bilaterally and
Hmm.
then in a minilateral or multilateral context, which creates challenges of a different kind. If India is only seen from the commercial aspect, it's military, strategic, diplomatic, sort of relationship with the US is sort of, is not at the same level and is not seen the same context, or India and South Asia, Indo-Pacific. So that's the issue which I see, that if you
Okay.
only see it bilaterally, you create a problem, a bigger problem. I'll stop there.
That's very good. But do tell me, I mean, I see this, this whole US China as this new G2 almost, But the NSS does mention China's predatory economic practices, its domination of Asia Pacific waterways. I mean, that's all being said many times over. And as Dr. Pandey said, we have to actually look at it differently. But it doesn't even mention a nuclear armed North Korea. I mean, Trump has said he wants to denuclearize it, but I don't think that's going to be possible. So, but that aside, on the larger picture, where do you see India living up to what is being asked of it?
At all.
Meena, I wanted to go back since you mentioned the nuclear. I think the START treaty is expiring on around February, early February 2026, and there exists no arms control treaty after this. And then you set off a chain by saying, we might nuclear test, although the second part of the sentence says we should be, not talking about war and not nukes, and we should be about ending the war in Ukraine. Now, when you have a situation like this and where the Europeans are, okay, there is a whole, I also think that overall, this whole Russia beyond a point is a distraction. Russia, like McCain said a long time ago, Russia is primarily a gas station masquerading as a country. And I think that's the whole Russia threat in the United States has been, it was done and dusted. China was the strategic adversary, all was going well. And a US Russia rapprochement, ironically, may not be the worst outcome for India. Actually, it would be one of the best outcome for India. And for a lot of people, even the Europeans, at the end of the day, geopolitics is a combination of geography and politics. The Europeans share their border with the Russians. So, you are hinging your security across the Atlantic, yet living very close to your neighbor who possesses nuclear weapons. And Merkel, you had a nuanced theme in 2007, 2008 around the NATO summit, and she discouraged Bush in expansion of NATO to countries like Georgia, all these countries. And the only mistake she did was she was not powerful enough with Bush. She should have been more aggressive and stop the American expansion, the American NATO project expansion beyond a point. So in all these kinds of things, I think the India was a good. It was the only. It had bipartisan successes in the United States. It was not a foreign policy challenge. It was not a cause for concern, but it was not. You came across a whole spectrum from 1974 to the early 2000s when you signed the nuclear deal. Okay, that was one of the biggest foreign policy wins for both these establishments. To see where it is going today, I think it's a significant setback, but nonetheless, both are aspirational, optimistic countries, and I, being an optimist, I think this challenge too shall pass.
That's very well put. Ambassador, would you like to wrap up for us? Would you on the way forward, because India has to find ways to, navigate, all of these various powers, and Zelensky is going to be looks as if he's going to be forced to hold elections, hand over territory to Russia.
So I want to pick up on something that Dr. Pandey said. I think she's right. US will deal with countries bilaterally, and this has implications for multilateral institutions I think there is nothing on multilateralism, whereas in previous versions of the NSS, there was something about advancing India, America's soft power, advancing America's influence. There's something on UN, something on NATO, something on WTO, and so on. None of that. So that's very clear. It's as clear as daylight to me that the US will now deal with countries bilaterally. Secondly, I do believe, rightly or wrongly, the US has determined that Russia is a major power and that they will deal with Russia the way they want to, regardless of European objections. So that is something they have to do. As far as India is concerned, I take heart from the fact that there are 26 sectoral dialogues. I just counted before this meeting. 5 domains in which 26 sectoral dialogues between US and India. 5 of them have happened in the last 3 months. Foreign Office consultations happened with Alison Hooker and Vikram Misri. Joint Working Group on Terrorism has met. A defense agreement lasting 10 years have been done. Military exercises are taking place. So I think we have to just hang in there and see whether we can resolve the trade issue. I don't believe this business of trust being broken. As a former diplomat, as an old man, please cut me some slack. I think diplomacy is unsentimental, frankly. Nobody believes in those things anymore. I sincerely believe US and India have permanent interests, and we will return to that particular level where we start tending to those permanent interests. I will see this as a setback, sure, but I think both countries are capable of bouncing back.
That's very interesting. Thank you very much. I just want to say in conclusion that India has to find ways to navigate its relations with the United States, Russia, and China, because these are the 3 powers that will dominate the spheres of influence as the US looks increasingly inwards. But the other important dimension, of course, is the launch of the US India strategic dialogue, strategic trade dialogue, Indo Pacific economic agenda. Both Delhi and Washington will be, looking at ways to, integrate further. I think this geopolitical realignment, I think, is very important. Thank you, Ambassador Mohan Kumar, for coming on the show. Thank you, Dr. Aparna Pande. And thank you very, very much, Mr. Bharath Gopalaswamy, for sharing your views on Global Express. Viewers, do click on the New Indian Express website and click and share Global Express. Thanks very much.